Hello and welcome to the Oak Spring podcast, where we celebrate the legacy of Mrs. Bunny Mellon through the work of the Oak Spring Garden Foundation. I'm Chris Stafford and this is Season 2, Episode 7. Hello, the theme for this month's episode is Landscape and Place. And we have two guests who will be sharing their perspectives. First of all, we'll hear from the author Max Loskutoff, and then later in the podcast, the author and educator Gretchen Henderson. But first, a couple of updates. This month in July, Oak Spring will host the Dumbarton Oaks Plant Humanities Summer Program, which is a group of advanced undergraduates and graduate students interested in plants from the perspectives of botany, botanical exploration, history of science and medicine, environmental studies, art history, literature, and the history of the book and botanical illustration. We also will be hosting our 600 Years of Botanical Illustration short course, which is a class led by Roger Gaskell in partnership with the Rare Book School. And you can find out more about our courses and programs here at Oak Spring by going to the website osgf.org. Our first guest here on the podcast this month is Max Loskutoff. Max was raised in the Rocky Mountains of western Montana, where he's joining us today. His debut collection of books, Come West and See, won the High Plains Book Award, was a New York Times Editor's Choice, and an NPR and Amazon Best Book of 2018. His debut novel, Ruthie Fair, of which it's been said, Loskutoff captures the vast and lonely land, along with its beauty and breathtaking descriptions of violence and empathy. He won the Montana Innovation Award and the High Plains Book Award in 2021 for Ruthie Fair, and received starred reviews from Kirkus, PW, and you'll have to tell us what that is in a minute, Max, and Booklist, and was a reading the West Award finalist. And his second novel, Old King, was published in June 2024, of which is said, Mr. Loskutoff is unmatched at evoking the contentious transitional nature of the American West. And again, this was an award-winning novel and named a Best Book of Summer by the Boston Globe and Minneapolis Star-Tribune, and a Best Book of the Year by NPR and PW. Loskutoff is unmatched, they say, as in evoking the contentious traditional nature of the American West, which I love that. I repeated it because I love that. I think that so very well captures your style of writing, Max. Does that resonate with you, what you're trying to achieve with your writing?
Absolutely. I think that the story of the West is a story of change and resistance to change. And we're very much still caught within the plot of that narrative. And so from the very beginning of the Europeans' time in the interior west of this continent, we've been aware of ourselves as outsiders and also as those who hold dominion. And so we're basically seeking to tame something both in the exterior and interior of ourselves that is, in a sense, untamable. And so we often find ourselves kind of in these deep existential battles that we then lay onto the majesty of the landscape.
Well, that is the topic of this month's podcast, Landscape and Place. So thank you for joining us, Max. We had the opportunity to meet when you were last here because you've now become a veteran of Oak Spring. This was your third visit this year. Tell us how you first connected. How did you become aware of Oak Spring initially?
Yes, I feel so lucky. I mean, a major part of my journey as a young writer, before I published any books, when I was just out there, desperately sort of seeking ways to create a life in which I could focus on telling stories. I began going to artist residencies after leaving full-time work as sort of a way that I could live essentially. I wasn't paying rent. I was just going from residency to residency. And through that process, I met a woman named Elizabeth Quinn, who is the director of a residency that I attended. And she was later hired as a sort of a consultant when Oak Springs decided to start its artist in residence program. I believe this was in 2017, 17 or 18. And she invited a cohort of four of us to be the first, to be the pilot group, to come out and basically make sure everything was working. And so, at this time there were just two houses that were ready for residents. When we did eat meals, we ate on the other side, in the main house, as it were, very grand in the ballroom. And so, yes, I got to sort of see the genesis of the program from its initial seeds to what it's become today, which is this beautifully high functioning, streamlined artist residency that feels like it's been around forever.
Well, we want to go back in time, if you don't mind, Max, and learn about how you became a writer. But let's start with your background, because you're very much in touch with landscape and place out in the Midwest there. Tell us a little bit about where you grew up and how you developed this passion for your writing.
I grew up in Missoula, Montana, which is a university town in a little valley in the Rocky Mountains in western Montana, and it's a very interesting place because it exists both within the national imagination as a place of wilderness, and yet when you are living there, it's also quite suburban. My childhood was actually very much an in-town childhood. I grew up a block from my high school, and I didn't come from a family of outdoorsmen. My dad loved to hike, but wasn't a hunter or a fisherman or the things that are kind of classically associated with that place. From a very young age, I felt myself to be primarily an observer of life rather than a participant, if that makes sense. And so I think if I wasn't a writer, I would be a painter or some other kind of artist, because I always felt myself a little bit apart from the activity of life, not in a negative way. It felt very natural, but it was always as if I was sort of watching the drama or the play unfold and trying to create stories or images to make sense of that. And in Western Montana in the 90s, when I was a little kid, it was very dramatically a story of a place in flux. It was transitioning, the economy in Missoula was transitioning from the extractive to the recreational industries. And what I mean by that is, when I was very small, two of the three main employers in Missoula were lumber mills. And by the time I graduated high school, both had closed down. And so the town itself, over that decade, the entire character changed from a kind of a lumber and logging timber town to a town very much focused around the university and around the kind of dream of the West that has increasingly been held by outsiders, a place where you can hike and mountain bike and ski and run the rivers in the spring and all of these activities. And so I watched sort of the industries of the town reorient themselves in that way, and all of the internal and political resistance that happened on the ground around me among my classmates during that time. As you grow older, it becomes a lot easier to sort of isolate yourself into bubbles of like-minded individuals. But when you're a kid in public schools, you don't have a choice who you talk to for 8 to 9 hours a day, for better or worse. And so I very much experienced firsthand the anger of the children of loggers who were losing their job, the anger of people who felt like the culture was not only leaving them behind, but castigating them, turning them into the villain, which, the accelerating environmental movement very much did in the 90s. It went from being this highly respected job in places like Missoula of being a logger to being associated with clear cuts and basically the destruction of our most precious national asset. And so as an observer, both of the landscape and the people within it, I found I had to attempt to kind of create stories to integrate and understand and not be, driven a little bit mad by all the tension and conflict I felt in the air around me in high school. And so, the beginning of my journey as a writer were these twin combined influences of being surrounded by the absolute splendor of the high Rocky Mountain wilderness, and the incredibly complex changes that were occurring during that time.
So, where did the interest in writing begin? What was the catalyst for that, Mac?
I'm the youngest of five, and I think I was always, as a child, seeking solitude and sort of spaces of my own. And when you're a little kid in a big family and a family that's very kind of sports and activity focused, a book is a very handy and portable sanctuary. You can always kind of bury your head inside it and be left alone. And so, a lot of my earliest memories were of finding kind of private places where I could, hide out in a book and sort of attempt to decide who I actually wanted to be rather than who, my family and siblings wanted me to be. And so they very naturally became kind of a part of my identity outside of that was very personally mine. And without even meaning to, in the way that these things happen when you're very small, the love of reading turned into a love of writing. I don't exactly remember the moment when I shifted from only reading to writing my own stories, but I still have the first my first ever attempt at a novel came when I was 5 years old. Pretty much unprompted, I started writing this very long story about a sea dog named Ray who has to keep rescuing his hapless captain who keeps kind of getting into trouble. And it's funny in a lot of ways. First of all, because I was an extremely landlocked child. We were over 1,000 miles from the nearest ocean, and yet my fantasies at that time took place on the high seas. But it just felt like a very natural thing to do. Like, I love books, so why don't I write one? And that kind of never left. It wasn't something that I got very much encouragement in until I actually left Montana and went to college. That was the first time that I was actually in creative writing classes and began to see it as a possible career path. But it had always been kind of an extension of the sanctuary that I found in creating worlds.
So you didn't get any encouragement from teachers or parents then when you were younger? No one spotted the budding author?
I didn't get any discouragement either. I will say, I mean, part of the beauty of being the youngest in a large family is that my parents had kind of, they'd run through a lot of different dramas with my siblings, and they were very open to me just being whatever I was going to be. And, particularly my mom was really fascinated by the fact that I loved to read so much and was producing these stories, and so she definitely encouraged it. And I did have a wonderful English teacher in high school who would have us keep a daily or a weekly fictional journal that I remember very distinctly. And he was kind of the first person who I remember reading my work and saying, oh, this is sort of different than what the other students are doing. You're actually kind of writing complete stories each week. And so I definitely didn't ever feel discouraged. And there is a sense of Missoula as a very literary town. It has a really great MFA program at the university, and a lot of great writers And a lot of the town's identity is built around a novel called A River Runs Through It. And so I was, there was an awareness somewhere in my subconscious that this was a place, a kind of a literary place. Um, and so, yeah, I don't feel like I was either encouraged or discouraged, which is sort of a blessed thing as a young writer. There isn't a lot of pressure. Nor expectation. And so it was very much something I did for myself at that time.
How did you transition from sea heroes to the landscape and the books that you choose to write about now?
Yeah, I had to overcome a kind of a deep and for many years unseen self consciousness that I had. Again, kind of left to my own devices, I developed the idea as a teenager that if I was going to be a writer, I needed to write about someplace else, that I was going to write about big cities like New York or Los Angeles. And I was determined to do both. And I did. I went to undergrad in Los Angeles and I went to grad school in New York. And I very much had the sense that this was going to be, that those were the stages upon which the great, the great stories were set. But I had the experience both in undergrad and grad school of teachers, of having really intuitive teachers and peers who were reading my kind of wild, often post-apocalyptic adventure stories that were, set in the deserts of Southern California or out, in abandoned sea colonies in the Pacific, and saying, you're from Montana. What was that like? Maybe, well, was there a story there? And, to be perfectly honest, I didn't fully embrace it until the second year of graduate school at NYU. I spent my first year working on a novel, a post-apocalyptic desert novel that I was, very sure was going to sort of set the world on fire, and handing it into workshops and being met with extreme, eh, not the reaction that any writer wants. They're like, oh, this is fine, And I definitely kind of got the sense over that year that I was sort of falling behind, and I came home to Montana that summer, and I think I was 24, 25 years old, and for the first time, I said, I'm going to write about my home. I'm going to write really what I know. And I spent that summer, every day I would go on this particular hike in the Rattlesnake Wilderness and really, really look around. And I kept coming back to this particular site. And it was the site where a homesteader had once lived. And now it's about 2.5 miles up a trail. And this homesteader had planted apple trees. And these apple trees had become an issue at this time, which was in the early aughts, because they were attracting bears. Bear populations had begun to return to the wilderness around Missoula after a lot of environmental efforts. And so suddenly these old apple trees were attracting bears who had come and eat the apples and scratch their backs on the trunks. And so the Forest Service was wrapping the trunks of these apple trees in barbed wire to keep the bears away. And I just would look at that every day and feel these different stories start to grow inside me. The story of what it must have really been like to live this far up a canyon, hundreds of years ago, very, very isolated from any other human contact for years on end, wanting this kind of literal taste of home to plant these trees, and then inevitably attracting predatory wildlife who also wants to eat this new and delicious fruit. And so that became the first story in my debut collection, and it really changed the trajectory of my writing forever, because I realized that my youth, this landscape that I had been observing so closely, without even meaning to during my formative years, was the story that I had to tell. And in a sense, that's what I've written ever since.
Well, I'm sure there are budding authors listening to this podcast, Max, who wonder how you found your first publisher and got your first book published, because I know from experience it is a journey in itself to get your first book on someone's desk, and not, the rejections are so easy in the beginning of a career. They just and they can be very off-putting, of course. It's like acting, or whenever you put yourself out there. So I'm wondering how you broke that barrier and got onto a publisher's desk, and who would accept you.
Absolutely. I mean, again, I think that it was sort of the gift of that expectationless childhood um, gave me a great capacity to accept rejection. I saw I had some really tremendously talented classmates at NYU who came from incredibly literary families and had gone to, private arts high schools and, had been basically trained in writing with the idea of publishing since they were very small. And so they had been feeling these tremendous expectations their whole lives. And, the added sum of the rejection, for some of them just was too much. And they ended up uh, never publishing. I had, again, since any kind of expectation came fairly late, it all felt like such a gift to me that I was very prepared and even expecting to be rejected for a really long time. So the great challenge for me after finishing grad school was how was I going to support myself? How was I going to make a living during what I knew was an incredibly important time as I tried to finish a first manuscript? And, finishing a first manuscript is like anything you do for the very first time. It's so much harder than it ever is again, because you're really learning every step of it along the way. And I was really lucky to have a roommate in New York who was a performing artist who would go to artist residencies every year. And he kind of opened that door to me. A lot of my classmates, I still, I often teach at the University of Montana, and I'm still amazed by how many of my students don't even know what a writing residency is. And I wouldn't have if it wasn't for Joseph. But he gave me his list, and when I finished grad school, I had a fellowship to teach for another year, and I saved a little bit of money and applied for a bunch of artist residencies. And after quite a bit of rejection there, I developed an application that was pretty successful, and I managed to get into about a 3-year stretch when I was almost completely living in artist residencies. And this gave me the time to integrate this new perspective I had on writing, writing my home, writing Montana, writing the interior West, and turn it into a manuscript. And then kind of simple trial and error to find the right agent to get it to the right publisher. I initially signed with an agent who had a very clear idea of what he wanted my work to be, which was more about him than it was about my work. And so, had a very difficult couple of years of working with him before I severed that relationship and basically blind queried an agent who I loved a lot of the young writers he represented, and he wrote back and had a really beautiful understanding of my work, and we've been together ever since. And I had other agents tell me that you have to have a novel before you go out with a collection of short stories, and he said, "Oh no, that's bunk. We can go out with these short stories." And yeah, we were lucky. We actually had a few editors who were interested, and so I think it's my experience is that the most difficult things to cultivate are again that thick skin for many years of rejection, patience. This is something I always try to teach. Like when you think something is done, it's really probably not. And the next time you think it's done, it's still not done. And then the third time, it's not until like the 10th time you think it's done that it might actually be getting close to done. Um, and then just a sense of adaptability, because we don't in our society these days have like a clear structure of support for young artists. A lot of the federal funding is gone, a lot of the state funding in most states is gone, and so you have to become, very much a seeker, to kind of create your own path. And that same roommate who gave me the list of residencies gave me a piece of advice that he had gotten when he was first starting out, which was, when you're starting out, you should spend half of your time making your art and half of your time applying for things. And I really took that to heart. I applied for everything, every funding, whether it was $100 or $40,000. I was going to apply for it, even if I didn't think I had a chance of getting it. And, it did pay off in the sense that I was able to put enough things together to complete that first manuscript.
So you put yourself in a position where you could always continue your writing as your main pathway.
Yeah, in a sense, for very much for my mid 20s to my mid 30s, I always put writing first, and that it did come, at the sacrifice of, a stable living situation. It came at the sacrifice of stable relationships, stable jobs. But I was very, I had a very singular focus during that time of kind of an internal knowing that for the writing to get where I needed it to be, it had to be my priority for a while. I don't necessarily feel that way anymore, but it was like I needed to give it everything at that time, so I could come to understand what I had to say and how to say it.
What do you think that writing per se, and then being a successfully published author, Max, has taught you about yourself?
Oh gosh, I mean, new things every day. I think that the more you allow it to, and the more honest you are, you're always working through your own stuff on the page. The things about yourself and the time and place that you were born into that you can't quite make sense of. And I often, in these three books, I think I started all three of them from a place of anger, of frustration. I started from a place of thinking about those loggers' kids who I grew up around, who were so angry and who, at first glance, felt so destructive to the landscape that I loved. But through the act of writing about them, that anger transmuted into something else. It transmuted into empathy, essentially, into an understanding of how complicated and short-sighted, in a certain way, or limited, all of our understanding of being a part of the natural world is. Not just those who were involved or continue to be involved in the extractive industries. It's a species-wide issue right now, where we kind of intuitively see the self as apart from the landscape rather than a part of the landscape. And so, the biggest thing that writing has taught me is just that. It's a way of, in my own life, aspiring to reunion with the natural world, rather than being trapped in this binary of, oh, I'm either here to save the earth or destroy the earth, which is often how the lens at which people are looking at our culture and the people within it right now. You're either here to save the earth or destroy the earth. And I think no matter what, we're here to be a part of the earth. It doesn't matter what you do, we're on a round trip journey here from Earth to Earth. You know, whatever you do in the space between, that's what's going to happen. And so, the biggest lesson it's taught me is attempting to live that way, and then also attempting to somehow express it in stories in the hope that it can be just a small part of what is such a necessary transition that we need to take as a species, from, again, kind of consumers to stewards, to put it perhaps oversimply.
And do you anticipate in the future that your writings will still be based in Montana, in the land that you know and love? Or will you go outside of Montana and go to the big cities even?
Yeah, it's really funny. I finished these 3 books and this body of work, and this year I've been kind of wrestling what to do next. And one night I was having dinner with my partner, and she said to me, you don't have to write about the West. And it was funny in the same way that, my very young self was so determined not to write about the West. I do think I kind of created another little container for myself of, oh, now I'm a writer of the West. And so I truly don't know. I don't want to say that I'm definitely going to do that. I do think that my primary interest in this life is wilderness, and particularly the landscape of the interior West. Like, it does feel so deeply a part of my being at this point that I think it will always be in the writing. But, a part of what I'm hoping to do this year as I begin a new project is open myself up to entirely new possibilities of, perhaps a novel set in a city, perhaps a novel set in another country, or perhaps a novel that has a non-human protagonist. I mean, there's a lot of different things that are kicking around inside me, and I'm trying to keep all the doors open.
Wonderful place to be then, already established as an author with lots more doors to open and possibilities. Max, we look forward to seeing you back here at Oak Spring. In the meanwhile, the very best of luck with your future projects.
Thank you so much, Chris. I can't wait to see you there again as well.
And thank you for taking time to come on the podcast. And we will be hopping over to our YouTube channel now for continued conversation with Max Loxikoff. So do join us there. Max, thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris.
Well, joining me now is Gretchen E. Henderson. Gretchen is an interdisciplinary scholar whose multimedia work traverses environmental arts, cultural histories, integrative sciences, and public humanities. She holds a bachelor's degree in history from Princeton University, an MFA from Columbia University, and a doctorate in English and creative writing from the University of Missouri, Columbia. Gretchen has written a few books, including Ugliness, A Cultural History and Life in the Tar Steeps, a spiraling ecology from a dying sea, and she is currently leading a global collaborative project titled Dear Body of Water to Cultivate Care for Watersheds. So, Gretchen, thank you for joining us on the podcast.
It's a delight to be here.
I've met you, of course, on your visits here to Oak Spring. So tell us how that connection first came about.
Sure. It was actually a pandemic meeting in many regards. I first met Oak Spring, and I think of that very much as meeting a kind of fellow living being, the landscape in 2020. At the time, I was directing a research division at the University of Texas at Austin, but grounded in Washington, D.C., where I'd been teaching at Georgetown University, and I had known about the library just very distantly at Oak Spring, which seemed marvelous. And there was a virtual evening course on reading the landscape that was offered, taught by Michael Gage and Peter Crane. And it looked so tantalizing with, of course, one field day, a Saturday. And at that time, we were all spending so much time indoors. And so took this lovely course on reading the landscape. That was the first short course that Oak Spring offered. And in conversations with Peter and a visit to the library, the course of writing the landscape was born.
Well, one of the projects I mentioned there in your introduction, Gretchen, was the Dear Body of Water collaboration that you're working on now. Tell us about that.
So Dear Body of Water actually grew out of my last book called Life in the Tar Seeps, A Spiraling Ecology for a Dying Sea. And that was about the closed basin of Great Salt Lake, which is a very vulnerable body of water in the American West. And the end of the book is filled with blank pages called Lost and Found, with the idea that the story of one body of water is incomplete without the voices of all bodies of water. And as we think of the human body as mostly being comprised of water, the planet is largely comprised of water. So we're all bodies of water. And that kind of the launch of the book became the launch of also this larger global initiative to cultivate care for watersheds everywhere. It's a collaboration with the University of Arizona Poetry Center, with Wick Poetry Center at Kent State University in Ohio, and the National Coalition of Poets for Science. And it invites people to write postcard-sized love letters to bodies of water, and really address them as a fellow living being, as our very lifeblood, to lean into the relationship that is already inherent. So water is viewed not as an inert, extractable resource, but really a space of interconnection that connects us all with this larger body of water that is the planet. And there are many different kind of waterways that are growing out of that, on the ground collaborations around the country, and beyond, which I'd be delighted to talk more about.
Well, let's just unpack that a little bit more then as to how this will unfold with the collaboration that you're involved with this title, and where you see it going. And do you have a time frame for it?
Yeah, so it launched in summer of 2023 at essentially the dry bed of the Santa Cruz River in Tucson, Arizona. And when you think about all the arterial networks that interconnect the West, even though Great Salt Lake is in a closed basin, the Colorado River watershed is very much an arterial network of the West, and all the bodies of water that feed into that as tributaries. And so it kind of became this call and response. And what started with material postcards that people send literally to a fishbowl mailbox in the University of Arizona Poetry Center grew into an online participatory portal. And I use that word portal very much as a kind of doorway to the larger project, which is watershed stewardship through the arts and humanities, integrated with the sciences. So if people have heard the acronym of STEM, I'm really leaning into that expanded acronym, not only STEAM, but STREAM, where the arts and writing and rhetoric are very much kind of stepping into the stream, literally and figuratively. And so there is a web network. The portal is dearbodyofwater.poetsforscience.org. And as postcards and love letters are submitted both by mail and then through that online portal, they grow this collective chorus, a kind of collective poem that's co-authored by many different voices, many different backgrounds, ages, languages. And so all of this chorus is hoping to renew attentions to watersheds. And that sense of renewal is very important, since none of this sense of relationship is new. This goes back to indigenous ways of knowing and centuries and centuries of human experience of living in reciprocity and balance with water, as opposed to over using and even abusing landscapes. So that larger collaboration is growing with different organizations, universities, environmental organizations, arts, nonprofits that are wanting to do more watershed stewardship in their own backyards, or are already involved in some renewal efforts where they want to turn up the volume on participation, or including the arts and humanities more deliberately. So just as a few examples, this spring, in the last 2 years actually, with the University of Wyoming's Nelchi Center for Excellence in Creativity in the Arts, I was working on a Listening with Water initiative that brought people from around the state through both the arts and humanities and the sciences, both through the university and other community engagements. And then Georgetown University currently has an exhibition up in special collections on Dear Body of Water, as well as a related student exhibition. There is the Leopold Writing Program in New Mexico, named after the Aldo and Estela Leopold, the conservationists, spent this past year using Dear Body of Water as a prompt for their statewide youth writing contest, which is very exciting to see kind of emerging leaders and voices of water. Falling Water, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright in Pennsylvania, also had an exhibition when I was in an artist in residence there in terms of a poetic water harvesting station. Montalvo Art Center in California, and Appalachian State in North Carolina. We're in the midst right now of planning an exhibition that will open in December, bringing together both installations, photography, films that I've been working on in collaboration to run through next May. And these are just a couple of the examples. There are many more that are underway, and it's really delightful to see how people are using, again, their own long time initiatives on the ground, and really kind of the local frameworks to think about building global bridges, because water is kind of a wonderful example of flowing across human-made bounds and finding ways to literally replenish us, even though it feels so delicate to be able to literally fill a glass of water that can become part of our lifeblood. It also is strong enough to wear down stone. So there are many things that we can learn from working with water.
Well, let's go back a little bit, Gretchen, to your beginnings as in academia and writing. Where did this come from? Is it something you inherited, or are you a pioneer in your family?
Oh, well, no, it's not part of my family at all, actually. In some ways, I'm a late bloomer if we think about all the plant metaphors at Oak Spring, because I came to writing rather late, even though I love to write. That it's not necessarily, the arts aren't a part of the kind of practice of my family, which is more really in the sciences. But I kind of fell in love with the arts through music. My backbone training is as a musician. So a lot of the frameworks that I bring to writing and pedagogy as well are through frameworks of listening. And through that, there were a variety of different early influences that led me into kind of human rights work, which I was very seriously considering for a while, histories, cultural histories, which was also an important part of listening and the framework and the work that I do. And then writing was not something I actually kind of thought you could do for a living. I had some wonderful teachers in college and in high school, but it was really after 3 years of teaching high school where I was piloting a program, an interdisciplinary program. I did a lot of interdisciplinary work and community engaged work that was rooted in environment and rooted in place, and took a night course in creative writing and kind of went down a scenic detour of a path that takes me here today.
So your first book, when was that published then? When did you actually get to the point where you became a published author?
Sure. My first book Yeah, so my first book was published in 2011, and I work across genres. So my first books were actually novels that were rooted in music, and also some nonfiction. I was very interested in these literary intersections of music and acoustics and spaces of listening. How the two-dimensional page is actually trying to represent a three-dimensional world, and what gets lost and found in translation, what voices move from foreground to background, what are different ways to essentially turn up the volume of our own attunement. And there are lots of different ways that these analogs can be also perceived in senses of landscape, what falls into the foreground of what we pay attention to or what we write about, what ends up in the background, and how we can decenter the human. So I worked on, again, my MFA was actually in fiction, but the course that led me into creative writing when I had been teaching that night course was actually called the short story, which was all I had time for at the point. But if it had been called the prose poem, I can see a lot of different ways that the work that I do maps around poetics and poetics of place. And that has definitely come into the braided practice that I do. But that work as a cultural historian and a scholar has also been an important part of the ways that I've also been very interested in the forms that storytelling takes back to our oral origins that are interconnected with music. And then even in the digital age, how our practices of reading move from the printed page that has deep and rich histories that are very much also attached to the natural world in terms of vellum and book histories, and then moving into this digital age, which requires a lot of natural resources to power even the very space of doing this interview digitally. And so those kinds of questions are constantly part of the larger questions around the questions of my research practice and writing practice. And in terms of doing, say, a book on ugliness, a cultural history, that sense of the aesthetics of landscape also becomes an important part of the perceptive work that I'm interested. For instance, the ways that it's easy to love a alpine spring if we go back to that consideration of water and watersheds, but it's harder to love, say, a quote unquote dead sea that might be what people call ugly or stinky. And then you can see practices of toxins or pollution dumps and other kinds of environmental justice issues that end up cohabiting those spaces that people neglect. So I'm very interested in where the writing practice with a kind of liquid understanding interrelates with the writing practices, the marks that we make on this earth. And that definitely seeps into the ways that I ask participants in either my Oak Spring courses or any of my university courses to think about our own eco-connections. What are the contexts around our texts?
Well, that leads me back to our topic for this month's podcast, Gretchen, and that is the role of landscape and place. So tell us how that shapes, then you put those things together, because we've led into it rather nicely, shaping your creative work today.
Yes, I see so many interrelations between language and landscape. And really, that was one of the true pleasures and privileges of teaching Oak Spring, where that threshold between the library and landscape is so porous. And that was kind of part of even that first introduction to Oak Spring was writing a little book that Peter Crane was kind enough to publish in a limited edition called Where a Library Meets a Landscape. But I was very smitten by the fact that the huge, the beautiful, almost 20,000 of objects in the extraordinary Oak Spring Garden Library. So many of them you can see echoes across the landscape in the way that Bunny Mellon brought into her gardening aesthetics, and certain blooms that we could see, in centuries-old texts, and walk outside and see them, especially when I've had the pleasure of returning to Oak Spring across many seasons now, to see things bloom blooming and the landscape entirely changing. And I'm very interested in this sense of kind of rewilding our imaginations. And I teach with that sensibility of really looking at our imagination as a garden, and looking into scientific studies of things like neuroplasticity. We know our brain is a living organism. It has that ability to open up in new and wondrous ways. And I worry in this world of increased fear that we are in some ways closing down our registers of care, and how to keep open, how to continue to seed the imagination as a landscape, the way that any kind of an agrarian system's understanding that monocultures are not good even in terms of harvest practices. There's wonderful kind of biodiversity and diversity in our reading practices as well, and how to not look at the environment as something separate from us, not out there, but really part of us. We are a micro full of micro environments. And as those connections are somehow cultivated through the art of attention by closer reading through what I call seed reading and seed writing, that sense of really renewing our Ika connection can continually be practiced. So there are seasons of dormancy. There are these cycles that are natural as we see seasons shift in every different ecosystem. And this is also a pleasure of teaching at Oak Spring, because the landscape, say, of the Mid-Atlantic and that particular right in the shadow of the Blue Ridge and Bull Run Mountains is very different from the many landscapes that participants have brought to our tables of both writing the landscape and my other course of literary ecologies there, or any of the workshops that I teach around the country. And as people are able to bring those comparative ecologies to bear and see that they're not separate, that they are all interrelated, it also begs lots of questions about how did we come to think that there's one way of writing around landscape, and in asking people to in some ways decenter the human from their writing and reading practices, many different kinds of narratives become possible, because all writing really is environmental. That some writers have chosen to move it to the background, and some it's at the foreground, and this is an exercise that's not stuck, just as our genres of fiction and poetry and nonfiction are essentially somewhat reductive, because those are classifications. But there are lots of ways of declassifying, especially as both our landscapes and our languages become rewilded.
So for those who are listening then, why don't you explain what your goals are for writing the landscape and are the literary ecologies then that you'll be bringing to Oak Spring again?
Yes. Well, a lot of it is really bringing people to a shared table where they can exchange ways of knowing and being in the world. We've had such incredible applicants to these workshops. So we've had people from across all parts of the country, 5 continents. So lots of different and disciplines as well, practices within academia, outside of academia, people beginning their careers, people who are emeritus in their careers. Really the idea, each of those workshops is very deliberately curated so that everyone comes as an expert in something and as a beginner in something else, so that we can really lean into unknowing and think about the different languages that we've acquired, sometimes habituated to without even necessarily knowing it, because we practice it with a kind of repetitive fashion. And when we hear different people talk about the same thing, but from different perspectives, all kinds of different languages come to bear. This is some of the work that I've done related to museum studies comes in a similar way. When you curate an object from a disciplinary stance, the same object can actually disappear from view at times, because the narrative around it can kind of take over a power to it where the object loses agency. And we think about water or something like that. It's not an object. We oftentimes objectify it. So So I ask people to kind of look at things. We read and kind of are inducted into histories of environmental literature, but moving beyond the canon, really looking at all writing as environmental and inviting people to bring their practices to the table, what they consider environmental writing, what vocabularies they use around language, around landscape, land, wilderness, environment, all of these kinds of things, and what more. So the associative values, the associative logics, and then think about kind of bridge building so that the courses both of the courses are as much about the art of perception and perspective as writing, because I think that's a strong editorial tool that's often underutilized. We kind of stick with the literalness of the page, but so much can get lost and found between the lines just by virtue of what we're seeing or perceiving in the world. As far as the literary ecologies, the subtitle is Reading to Re-inhabit the World. And it is utilizing this framework that I came up with years ago called seed reading and seed writing, because oftentimes I meet practitioners who say, I don't have time to begin something new. I want to write about the environment, but that's not my field. And I think it's everyone's field. And I want everyone to feel that they have a place at the table and that their voice matters, just like every drop of water matters. And so that sense of being able to kind of start where you are and provide a framework that is small as a seed, because I love how seeds in some ways hold both the histories and the futures of the world. But it's up to us to plant them, to tend them, to learn from them, to know that what we do affects kind of the climate conditions of whether they thrive or whether they die. And that sense of really looking at language as an ecosystem, going back to that root sense of ecology and oikos, not something like just a house, but a home, literally all the relationships of which we're part of, all that makes a life. We can kind of see again ourselves not as separated from, but potentially reintegrated back into. And people are at different stages of this. For some, it's been part and parcel of who they are across the entirety of their life. For some, it's felt like they've been removed for generations. And oftentimes this is through the legacies of colonization and other kind of extractive practices. Even scholarship is a kind of extractive practice. And so to think about what is possible to open up these practices that are full of rich histories, full of harvests that we can learn from, and that we aren't necessarily, we may feel like we're inheriting the apocalypse right now, but there are still these seed-sized spaces of agency that can be very caringly tended. And what I love about these tables of bringing strangers together, it's always moving to see how people who come together who wouldn't normally find themselves at the same table end up leaving friends and colleagues, and in many ways stay in touch, because I continue to teach a number of alumni workshops. And so it's really beautiful to see how their practices can continue to grow landscapes that connect them across miles.
Well, I know we're going to be seeing you back here later in the year, Gretchen. What are those dates for your next course at Oak Spring?
I'll be teaching the alumni workshop the first week of November, and I'm very much looking forward to welcoming back alumni. And then I'll be doing a literary ecologies course next spring at the end of April.
Excellent. Well, we look forward to having you back here at Oak Spring, and thank you very much for taking time to come on the podcast this month.
It's been a delight to join you, Chris. Thank you so much for all your thoughtful questions and the work that you do for Oak Spring as well.
And you'll find some extended conversation with Gretchen if you hop over to our YouTube channel. That's Oak Spring Garden Foundation on YouTube, and you'll find a lot more content, video content, and of course all the podcasts too. And finally, a reminder that you can find out more about our programs, courses, and events here at Oak Spring by going to the website osgf.org, and you can also sign up for our newsletter there as well. If you prefer to email us, our email address is program@osgf.org. And there are regular updates on our social media channels. On Instagram, we're at Oak Spring Garden Foundation. On X, we're at oak_spring. On Facebook, Oak Spring Garden Foundation. So lots of ways to keep up with our regular news here at Oak Spring. But that's it for this month's episode. My thanks again to our guests, Max Loskatoff and Gretchen Henderson. Don't forget, wherever you're listening to the podcast, to share this with anyone you think might enjoy the show too. I'll be back next month with another episode of the Oak Spring podcast. Until then, thank you for listening.